Hello. I'd like to talk about discipleship, as many people have asked me to share from my own experiences of life. Perhaps the greatest gift that God has given to mankind is free will. Have you ever thought what it would be like to be a robot? Being programmed would mean not having to think or make decisions for ourselves. But we are different. Every day we have to make thousands of decisions. We can't escape it. Even if we make up our mind to make no decisions, then that's a decision in itself. So it's very important what decisions we do make. Our life hangs on it. There's no such thing as a small decision. One little decision can affect the whole course of our life. What's the most important decision we can ever make in our life? Is it the decision to follow Christ? You'd think so. But I believe that there's a much more important decision that we have to make after we become Christians. How can I say that? Can anything be more important than the decision to follow Jesus? Well, what about discipleship? Jesus has too many followers and not enough disciples. There's a big difference. Following Jesus is easy, but being a disciple, now that's very costly. It's a big decision. People think that when we follow Jesus, we get our ticket to heaven and that's it, we're safe. Well, no, we're not. Because Jesus isn't looking for followers. He's looking for disciples. I'd like to share with you my call to discipleship. I'd seen it happen so many times before as I was growing up. I'd had really good friends who were dedicated Christians and had been called to God, by God to serve Him in a ministerial capacity. And they'd faithfully done so until they found a husband and children had come along. From that point onwards, they felt that their ministry had changed, and now God wanted them to be submissive wives and godly mothers. This had always jarred with me because I couldn't see how this could be a ministry from God. I could only see it as fulfilling duty. Otherwise, millions of non-Christian people in the world had also been given this ministry and were doing their job very well. So I vowed that this would never happen to me. Maurice and I continued to take ministry engagements, but allowed a gap of 3 months when I would be having our baby. Nathan was just 6 weeks old when we took him off on our first engagement held in England. And at 10 weeks old, we took him to America for 4 weeks. We came back for 10 days and then took him off again to Holland for another 5 weeks on intensive ministry. I never realised I would have so many trials just being a mother. Before becoming pregnant, I'd never had any interest whatsoever in children, so consequently, I was not prepared for the vast changes that motherhood was about to bring in my life. From the time of his birth, poor little Nathan had been subjected to different countries, homes, beds, people, and the only constant thing in his short life was the breast milk that he had received from me. Towards the end of our ministry in Holland, he seemed to go through a time of acute insecurity. And during the night time, he would wake up every single hour for the comfort of being breastfed. At times, he'd sleep for only 20 minutes before needing to be fed again. It seemed as though he constantly needed the comfort that only I could give him. This, of course, drained me terribly, as for days the baby kept me awake day and night, and the ministry became a really exhausting ordeal. Sometimes we had to travel for 2 hours before arriving at a meeting. And then after the service had finished, we spent another 2 hours travelling before arriving home to get wearily into bed. My concentration and my patience went. I was on the verge of tears all the time. I was actually heading for a breakdown. This was one time in my life when I felt I needed to make a really big decision. At that point, Maurice and I had been working together in the ministry for 25 years, and we prided ourselves on always keeping our engagements, no matter what obstacles were put in our path. But during this period of ministry in Holland, I let him down twice, and he had to preach on his own whilst I stayed at home, as I just felt too weak to carry on. I felt so low that I confided in the wife of the pastor who headed up the organisation. She listened with concern to what I shared and told me that she had been in a very similar position herself and had needed to make important changes in her own life in order to give time to her children and to free up her husband. She counselled me to do the same as she had done, something I felt Maurice would not take kindly to. But I knew I had to do something about my situation, and so I made the decision to give up my part in the ministry for about a year in the hope that Nathan could get into some sort of routine. Since the theft of our musical instruments a few months prior to Nathan being born, Maurice had developed really well where his preaching was concerned. So I did my best to encourage him to continue taking bookings without me for this period. As I anticipated, no, Maurice was not happy with my suggestion. And for the next couple of months after returning to England, we'd planned to fulfil some local engagements and take a holiday before embarking on another tour, this time of Scotland. I tried to persuade Maurice to get in touch with the ministers to let them know that I wouldn't be going with him, just to warn them of what was happening, as at that time our ministry was based around my singing. But Maurice wouldn't discuss it with me. He just kept telling me to wait until nearer the time. I felt sure in my mind that God had spoken to me, so I just waited for the situation to sink into his head. Well, on the Sunday of our holiday, we visited a local church and I asked God to speak to Maurice to let him know what he'd told me. But throughout the sermon, instead of the minister speaking to Maurice, he was speaking directly to me. He was talking about Peter and his failures, and in particular, his denial of Jesus Christ. You know, when Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't find Peter with the other disciples. He found him back at work, fishing, doing his old job. And it was during this time of failure that Jesus called him, yet again, to be his disciple and fulfill his will. The minister stressed that the circumstances were not important. What was important was the call. This particular phrase hit me hard, and I had to examine myself. You see, I knew I'd been called by God. All my life I'd known a sense of destiny, and I had known that God wanted me in the ministry. Then God brought the scripture to my mind that unless a man was willing to forsake his father, mother, sister, brother, children, lands, houses, everything for his name's sake, then he wasn't worthy of the kingdom of God. I was convicted, terribly convicted. In tears, I made the promise to God that even though I knew it was going to be very costly, I would take up my cross and follow him. At the end of the meeting, I told Maurice that I would be going with him to Scotland and that I would be taking up my position by his side in the ministry, even though I had Nathan in tow. The very moment that I gave up control of my life was when God stepped in and took hold of me. You'd not believe that by making one decision, God could bring so many blessings into my life. The week after I returned from holiday, I received a telephone call from a Dutch minister who asked me if I would go over to Holland to sing at their Pentecostal meeting, which was scheduled to be held at the Congress Hall in Den Haag. This meeting was to be filmed and shown on Dutch cable television. After looking at our diaries, Maurice and I realised that this was the only weekend free of ministry that we'd had for quite a long time. As Maurice had already made arrangements to be away at a recording studio in Scotland during this period, he told me to go ahead and accept the invitation. I telephoned the minister, and all the arrangements were made for myself and Nathan to have the tickets waiting at the airport. I'm at a loss to describe how I felt at that particular moment, but one thing was sure. I knew that this was the Lord endorsing my decision to carry on in the ministry. At the end of the weekend, as I was preparing to come home to England, somebody came up to me with an envelope containing £125 and told me that this wasn't for the ministry. This was for my own personal needs, and I had plenty. This was 25 years ago, so you could triple that amount now. You know, in all the years that I've been ministering for the Lord, nobody has ever given me a personal, sizable gift like that before or since. I came back to England really blessed and encouraged by the Lord. A couple of days later, I was having a chat with Paula, Maurice's younger daughter. She'd recently come to live at Barratt Ministries and had noticed that I needed help where the baby was concerned. So she offered her services, saying that she'd come to Scotland with me so that she could babysit every evening while I was out with Maurice at the meetings. As we used to take a 5-berth caravan with us when touring in the UK, this meant that Nathan, who was still only 7 months old, would be sleeping in the same bed every night, being looked after by the same person for the whole month. And as he'd already become very fond of Paula, I knew that this was an answer to my prayer. 18 months later, I was back in Holland again, this time in a 3-bedroomed apartment which had been provided by the Dutch organisation we helped. Maria, Maurice's elder daughter, was there with us too. When Maurice and I went out on ministry, Maria faithfully came and looked after her little brother, who adored his big sister, which meant that Nathan could sleep in his own bed each night and keep some sort of routine in his life, even though Maurice and I were here, there and everywhere for the Lord. You know, I've learned a lot having children. This particular sequence of events showed me how God feels about responsibility. I can't thank God enough for the way He provided for all my needs. My biggest fear was leaving Nathan with other people whilst I was away so much. But God had already foreseen my decision to take up my cross and prepared His 2 older sisters, who didn't do this task out of duty, but because they really did love and enjoy their little brother. Being a mother is a tremendous responsibility. But you know, being a father who has to look after both mother and child, and that's what God was to Nathan and myself, must be a far greater responsibility. And God seems to have done that very willingly indeed.